The British invasion of Zululand had all of the hallmarks of a classic Victorian military expedition. On a slim pretext, a strong British force was advancing upon a numerically superior but outgunned native force. Years of experience suggested that it was to be only a matter of time before the Union flag once again flew in triumph over a defeated foe. Within a few short days, however, this confident prediction was to be shattered by the last army of a proud warrior nation in what was to prove the most serious military reverse ever inflicted upon the British Army by a native force. The decision by the British High Commissioner to invade Zululand in 1879 appears, from a modern perspective, to carry not the faintest trace of legality or moral justification. But the rules of diplomacy under which Sir Henry Bartle Edward Frere was operating, although separated in time from us by only 100 years or so, were so completely at odds with our modern values that they belong to an altogether different age. The age of the British Empire. Despite the colourful and romantic associations which images of red-coated heroes can still stir in the blood of the British, the reality of foreign policy under the Victorian regime was often as brutal and barbaric as the fierce conquests of the Roman Empire or the worst outrages of Napoleon. Queen Victoria's empire had been founded upon military strength, and its continued expansion, even in 1879, was still dependent upon the use of naked force. As Governor of the Cape, Sir Bartle Frere had inherited the difficult task of bringing the fragmented South African colonies and states into a single confederation under the rule of the British Crown. He knew only too well that such a task could not be achieved by even the most skillful tact and diplomacy. As the events of the intervening 20 years were to prove, the only way in which the various Boer republics and independent native kingdoms could be brought under British sway was by subjugation through force of arms, culminating in the bloody Boer War of 1899.
I think to understand why the Zulu War took place, we have to look a bit about the context in which 19th century Africa was being organized. There were really two sets of clashing problems. First of all, there was a clashing problem between different native tribes. But on top of that, there is the international rivalries which we have to think about. Because it wasn't just the British, of course, creating an empire in Africa. As far as South Africa was concerned, we had the Dutch Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And of course, that would later in the century lead to the Boer Wars. Then there was, just to the north of Zululand, they had the Portuguese, who also were having claims on Zulu territories. And therefore, the whole complete complex of international problems between different European powers superimposed on top of the local native troubles. And of course, we have to look at what Britain was about in all this, because we are the prime movers in this war. There was a great concept, which people like Cecil Rhodes were preaching at this time, that there was going to be, they hoped, Cape to Cairo railway, right down Africa, therefore, going all the way through British territory. And it was going, therefore, to be necessary for us to drive a corridor right up the centre of Africa, and that would involve, in part, taking over parts of Zululand. That was the big dream, which, of course, was never going to come into fruition. But these are the kind of problems which, in my opinion, make strife, warfare, at whatever scale, inevitable.
Frere knew that there could only ever be one outcome from such a war, the total British victory. Despite the many subsequent setbacks, this analysis was to prove correct. In reality, the Zulu people could never hope to defeat the resources of the British Empire. Much of the evidence from the Zulu and Bantu wars against the Boers justified this analysis, as the Boers had often defeated an enemy which vastly outnumbered them. In 1836, at the Battle of Wegkop, less than 200 Boers, armed with the old-style muzzle-loading muskets, inflicted a crushing defeat on 5,000 Matabele warriors, killing 1,700 in the process for the loss of only 2 men. At Blood River in 1838, 3,000 Zulus were slain by a Boer force who, in return, lost not one single man. Such was the lethal superiority of gunpowder over native weaponry. Faced with this stark scenario, it seems almost incomprehensible in the late 20th century that the official representative of the reputedly civilizing British Empire could also be capable of the pig-headed tactics of the school bully. There seems to be no alternative description for Frere's undignified search for any pretext for war with the Zulu people and their king, Katsweyo. The Colonial Office, struggling with a war in Afghanistan and faced with the prospect of further conflict with Russia, vetoed the proposed invasion of Zululand. However, communications between England and the Cape took some considerable time, and as such the governor on the spot enjoyed a degree of independence of action which allowed him to react to local events with the use of force if necessary. Frere used his own authority and the flaws in the communication system to act against the wishes of the Colonial Office and to his own ends. He thought he had finally found the excuse he had sought to justify war in July 1878, when a border commission was set up to arbitrate between the Boers of the Transvaal and the Zulus on the exact position of the border between the two regions. Both sides claimed ownership of large tracts of land in Natal, and Frere felt confident that the commission would naturally come down on the side of the Boers. He intended to use this judgment as the springboard for immediate action to clear the Zulu people from the disputed territory. Frere anticipated that in the process the Zulu king would be provoked beyond restraint, and war would inevitably result. He continued to lay these plans, despite the expressed wishes of Her Majesty's government. It came as a great shock to Frere, therefore, when the Border Commission found in favor of the Zulus. Not one to be discouraged by legal or moral claims, Frere hedged the settlement with some additional terms, which had nothing to do with the dispute, but which he knew would prove unacceptable to the Zulus. Chief among these demands was an order for the effective disbandment of the Zulu army, an impossible request to make of a warrior nation. The army was the foundation of the Zulu state, and the end of the army effectively meant the end of the nation. To ensure there could be no mistake this time, Frere allowed only 30 days for the Zulu king, Katsweyo, to comply with his unreasonable demands. On the 31st day after the delivery of the ultimatum, British forces preemptorily entered Zululand. Frere had achieved his aim, and the fate of the Zulu nation was sealed.
Of course, the case against Sir Harry Frere is complex. He had a dream, of course. He was one of those individuals who thought they were going to influence history. And there's no doubt, I think we have to admit, he had it in for the Zulus. He said, sooner or later we will fight the Zulus, and we know that General Chelmsford agreed with him. So the senior military and the senior political man were acting in total accord on this particular matter. So Frere, in my opinion, has been made, of course, the scapegoat for the Zulu War, which I think most people now would regard as an unjust war, in fact, for reasons we may get onto later. But he was made a scapegoat, so he's brought back, in fact, in disgrace from South Africa the year after this particular war. On the other hand, I think he was fairly pragmatic and a realist and had an idea of what had to be done in Southern Africa and was determined to do so. So to make him completely the villain of the piece, I don't think is quite fair. He was a very conscientious, very hard-working civil servant who later on went into the business of writing his own memoirs and so forth to justify his actions in Africa and India and elsewhere. But I believe he was a very good a servant of the British Empire as it then existed. There's that famous phrase, which I must quote at this point. Good the British Empire was not always, but it was undeniably great.
Surviving Zulu accounts make it abundantly clear that King Katsweo wanted peace, and was even prepared to accept some of the less humiliating demands made by Frere. But he knew he was being goaded into war for reasons he could not understand. In November 1879, he had sent his own message to the British Governor of Natal, Sir Henry Bulwer.
Katsweo hereby swears in the presence of Hanu, Mayama and Chingwai and all his other chiefs that he has no intention or wish to quarrel with the English. I did you no wrong, and I have done you no wrong. Therefore, you must have some other object in invading my land. The king begs you to desist from laying Zulu land to waste. My warriors have not yet taken up arms, and we await your settlement. But the ordinary Zulus from the country where the British troops are laying waste naturally take the alarm and arm themselves. But these are my people, and they are simply defending themselves. The whole Zulu army is not yet mobilized.
Increasing pressure was on Katsweo to resist the British incursion into Zululand. Already the British were burning Zulu homesteads and killing innocent civilians and warriors alike. On the 16th of January, 5 days after the commencement of the British invasion, he was forced to fully mobilize his army. The army which Katsweo called upon in this dire emergency was in fact not just one, but 4 separate armies, in response to a formidable and well-conceived British strategy of encirclement. Under the overall leadership of Lord Chelmsford, the available British forces had been split into 5 separate columns. 2 columns were to remain behind to guard against Zulu counterattacks into Natal. The other 3 would each make a separate thrust into Zululand, ultimately to converge upon the Zulu capital at Ulundi. Number 1 column, commanded by Colonel C.K. Pearson of the 3rd Foot, later the Buffs, was to cross into Zululand across its southern border near the coast and strike northwards for Ulundi, while Number 3 column, commanded by Colonel Glynn and accompanied by Lord Chelmsford himself, would drive due east from Rorke's Drift. The 3rd component in the encirclement of the Zulu capital was to be Number 4 column, commanded by Colonel Wood. Number 2 column, under Lieutenant Colonel Durnford, was to remain stationary on the Tugela River to guard against Zulu incursions into Natal, while Number 5 column would be based on Luneburg to the north, to protect against a possible Zulu invasion from that direction. The news of the arrival of 2 fresh infantry battalions from England after the long sea journey caused a slight change of plan, which was to have far-reaching consequences. With his rear now secured, Lord Chelmsford ordered Colonel Durnford's Number 2 column to move up to join his own forces marching east from Rorke's Drift. Durnford was a reckless adventurer who was spoiling for a fight, so he lost no time in moving his men up. Even with the addition of Durnford's men, the forces which Chelmsford had at his disposal were not all that he would have hoped for to meet such a serious undertaking. However, with the Foreign Office openly opposed to an all-out war at that precise time, Frere and the military commander, Lord Chelmsford, decided to accept a compromise of an invasion with limited forces in January, against the worrying prospect that they might, at some future date, be prevented from coming to grips with the Zulus at all. The 5 British columns, therefore, were a mixed force of 5,000 British regular infantry, 1,400 regular and irregular cavalry, and some 9,000 native troops who formed the Natal native contingent. Many of these men were disaffected Zulus. They were poorly equipped, armed, and dressed exactly as their Zulu opponents. They still carried shields and spears in the main, and were distinguished only by the red headband they all wore. The British forces were supported by 16 artillery pieces, a rocket battery, and a lone Gatling gun.
The British force which went into Zululand under Chelmsford was divided into 2 parts. There was the regular forces, of course, who were very good, But above all, there were the irregular forces, who were a very substantial proportion of the whole. Now, these, frankly, were not very good. They tended to be underarmed, because they had all sorts of last year's model muskets and so forth. They also had a tendency, I'm afraid, to run away on a few occasions during this campaign. And yet, General Chelmsford relied on the native cavalry element for his intelligence, and this was going to be a vital thing that went wrong just before Isandlwana.
The 5,000 British red-coated regulars who formed the backbone of this army were without doubt some of the best regular soldiers in the world. The British Army, although comparatively small by Victorian standards, was even then a professional army composed entirely of volunteers. The men served through choice rather than conscription or impressment, so they were highly motivated, well-disciplined, and fiercely loyal to the crown which they served. By 1879, much of the British Army had already discarded the conspicuous scarlet coats of old for khaki drab, but the forces serving in South Africa were among the last to change. The British troops in the Zulu Wars were, therefore, the last field army to wear the scarlet coats of Waterloo in a major war. On campaign, the soldiers who fought in the 24th Regiment would have borne little similarity to our fond perceptions of the smart British soldier. Their uniforms would have become torn and tatty over 2 years of active service without reissue, and many of the men sported full beards. But if the uniforms were outdated, the weapons were not. The British were armed with the new breech-loading Martini Henry rifle, which had replaced the old muzzle-loading muskets which had served the British Army up to the 1860s. The benefits of the Martini Henry lay chiefly in the much greater rate of fire which it could deliver. Previously, the soldiers would have had to pour gunpowder down the barrel of their muskets, ram home a lead ball, then ram in a further piece of wadding to hold it in place, and replace the ramrod in its holder before a shot could be fired. Now it was simply a matter of feeding a brass bullet into the firing chamber, and the rifle was loaded. It was this great advance in the rate of firepower which led to the confident assumption that if a small force armed with muzzle-loading muskets could inflict the enormous casualties suffered by the Zulus at Blood River, then what slaughter would a modern professional force equipped with breech-loaders be capable of? Nonetheless, despite their overall confidence, the men of the small British force held their adversaries in some measure of respect.
I received your ever-loving and welcome letter of 23rd December, the one which you wrote on 20th November, and the one which you sent the Christmas compliments in. I was very pleased to hear from you, and to hear that you are quite well in health, hoping that you will remain so. I don't think that we shall finish this war so soon and easy as the other. For they are a better lot of men and more of them, and they have got rifles the same as we have. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that there will be many a poor wife lose her husband, and many father and mother lose their son. I'm afraid, but I hope and trust to the Almighty that I shall not be one of them, for my own darling's sake.
Encountering little opposition from the Zulus, the British Third Column had crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift and moved on to Isandlwana, where they arrived on the 20th of January, 1879. The peculiar shape of the mountain at Isandlwana reminded the men of the 24th of the Sphinx badge which they wore on their collars in memory of their regiment's gallantry in Egypt against Napoleon. The mountain under which Lord Chelmsford chose to pitch his camp therefore became known to the men as the Little Sphinx. To the Zulus, it was Isandlwana, the Little Hand. Having stationed one company of the 24th Regiment, later the South Wales Borderers, at Rorke's Drift to form a stores depot, Lord Chelmsford still commanded a reasonably strong force with which to confront a foe who was still only armed, in the main, with shields and spears. Although a few of the Zulus possessed rifles, their numbers were very few, a situation which King Katsweo was quick to recognize.
I called the whole army together at my kraal. It had so many men that they seemed to stretch right from there to the sea. The first thing I did was to give them cattle to eat and beer to drink. Then I asked them, "Is this the whole impi then? Lift up your guns." There were very few guns, so I told them, each one with a beast must bring it the next day and buy guns from the white traders.
Despite this obvious lack of firepower, Katsweyo had at his disposal a sufficiently large force to command the respect of his enemies. To combat the threat of the column commanded by Colonel Glynn, the king could bring to bear some 20,000 fiercely loyal warriors. In advance of Lord Chelmsford's main column had gone two parties with orders to locate the main impi. The first of these was commanded by Rupert Lonsdale, with 16 companies of the Natal native contingent. The second under Major John Dartnell, with a much smaller party of Natal mounted police and volunteer horsemen. About 12 miles from the camp, Dartnell encountered a force of 1,000 Zulus blocking his advance. With the limited forces available to him, he decided that there was no alternative but to stay where he was and send back to Chelmsford for reinforcements, so he could launch an attack the following morning. On receipt of the request, Chelmsford concluded that Dartnell had encountered the main Zulu impi, and he accordingly took the fateful decision to join Dartnell with a strong force, whilst leaving Major Pullein and his men at the camp. Lord Chelmsford took with him 6 companies of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th, 4 guns, and 1 company of Natal native horse. In the camp at Isandlwana, he left Major Pullein and 5 companies of the 1st Battalion 24th, along with 1 company of the 2nd Battalion 24th, supported by 2 field guns, 100 mounted police and volunteers, and 600 Natal natives. In total, some 1,200 men. Before he left the camp at Isandlwana, Lord Chelmsford had issued instructions to the reserve column under Colonel Durnford to make their way there. Although this force did not hold any British regular infantry, it did include the 1st Regiment of Natal Native Cavalry, which had fought with distinction in numerous frontier wars, along with a rocket battery commanded by Major Russell. This welcome addition to his forces should also, in theory, have relieved the unwelcome burden of command of the camp from the shoulders of Major Pullein, who, in 24 years as a regular soldier, had never heard a shot fired in anger.
Now, Major Pullein, in fact, was a soldier of considerable experience of being in the army, but as we know, had very little, in fact no, military experience prior to this. He was therefore thought, wrongly as it turned out, to be a good man to be a camp commandant in the rear looking after the supplies. However, there are 3 factors about it. Not only his inexperience as the first, the second one is that, of course, he refused to entrench the position, which was in fact standard requirement. But because the men were very tired, he decided that was not necessary. And in his favour, General Chelmsford also said it was not necessary. But there was no attempt even to make a laager of wagons, which again was absolutely basic for fighting in native wars in Africa, particularly the southern part. That was an oversight. So I think we can say that rather like the situation in Tobruk in 1941-42, when General Klopper and the South African Division were put into the, in brackets, safe garrison duty at Tobruk, somebody was suddenly found to be absolutely in the front line, in a crucial position, just like General Klopper had to surrender to Rommel, so of course Pullein and his garrison were not well prepared for an attack upon them.
Lord Chelmsford was probably justified in his confidence that the camp he left behind was sufficiently well protected, and that his own force of well-armed regulars was enough to deal with the main Zulu impi. But he was wrong in his assumption that the Zulus lay ahead. As he pressed east, they were already behind him, moving between his force and the camp and closing all the time on the Little Sphinx, the mountain of ill omen. The Zulu warriors who were bearing down on the unsuspecting British camp at Isandlwana still fought using the weapons and tactics developed by Shaka Zulu, the warrior leader who had shaped the nation. Each warrior carried a hide shield and a broad-bladed stabbing spear, the Iklor. Additionally, some carried 2 light throwing spears, or the infamous wooden knobkerrie, the Iwisa, a wooden club used to dispatch opponents with a fearsome skull-crushing blow. Catswayo's men were trained to close with their enemy and to fight at close quarters. This tradition made them feared opponents in hand-to-hand combat, but rendered them almost totally ineffective against well-dug-in troops who could keep them at bay with superior firepower. Catswayo recognized these weaknesses and specifically instructed his men to avoid battle with British forces in entrenched or fortified positions. The tactic which Catswayo relied upon to eat up the white man in the open was the proven Zulu battle formation for the Impi, the Horns of the Bull. The Bull formation was composed of 4 separate elements, each comprised of thousands of warriors who formed the horns, head and torso of a gigantic imaginary African bull. The main body of experienced warriors formed the chest of the bull as they charged towards the enemy. But as the formation neared its opponent, 2 horns, formed of the youngest, fittest men, would spread out from the main body in an attempt to envelop the opposition. A reserve of veteran, well-drilled men known as the loins would be held back in support of the chest or horns as the situation demanded. This was the system which the great Shaka had perfected and which was to serve Catswayo equally well on the fateful 22nd of January, 1879. Chelmsford was still confident that the main Zulu force lay ahead. His mind was therefore on a likely conflict between his own men and the Impi, which he believed would first have to defeat his own strong column before it could pose any threat to the camp. In fact, the Impi was at rest, a mere 4 miles from the camp, hidden in a valley, and already some 12 miles to the rear of Chelmsford's force, who were all the time moving further away from the Zulu army.
There's no doubt in warfare, ancient or modern, matters of intelligence are of the most critical importance. And it was a breakdown in Chelmsford's intelligence at this juncture that really doomed the column of Durnford to disaster. Here we have Chelmsford acting on imperfect intelligence brought in by undertrained native horse, in particular one lieutenant who gave him a report saying the Impis are over there, when in fact they were over there, which there was no help to the commander. And in fact, as we know, while he was marching further away from the camp area and Durnford, the mass of the Zulu Impis had come round behind the great Izindwana feature and were about to attack his rear. So here we have a classical example of a great surprise attack being brought off by the Zulu Impis and a British commander blinded by false intelligence making completely the wrong deductions.